All right, we're now to the point, I think, where we can develop our own chronology based on Scripture. You just took a look at some of the confusion that surrounds an Egyptian chronology and trying to date the Exodus, trying to date the time of Joseph. And so, what we want to do is try to look at Scripture itself to figure out what Scripture has to say. And I think we could put things together in a way that at least makes sense, and then we can begin to fit our other evidence to Scripture, which we think is a much more reliable source. All right, so let's start with the dedication of the temple. Most people agree that the dedication of the temple happened, that Solomon's reign began around 970, 971, and so the dedication of the temple, the beginning of the temple would have started maybe 765. Remember, we're going down. This is BC. Um, and as you can see from the slide, Solomon's reign begins around 970, 971. The reason sometimes biblical dates are shown like that is because the year starts at a different time. And so, give or take a year is what we need to accomplish. Right? But 1 Kings 6:1 says, in the 480th year after the people came out of the land of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord. All right, so now we sort of have a good historical agreement on where to begin our chronology. The dedication of the temple happened at this time, and so uh, it's interesting to watch as Solomon plans the temple because it was initially designed by David. The materials were beginning to be saved for the time when Solomon would build the temple on two places that are historically important. When David asks for that census and puts Israel in danger to 4 days of death angel passing through, that death was stopped at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, which actually turns out to be the place where the temple would be built by Solomon. Even more interesting is it is the place where God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on the mountains of Moriah. They're all the same place, and this is where God focuses his attention, build his temple to stop the curse, to stop the consequences of sin by sacrificing his own son on the cross. All right, so this is our beginning date then. We've got an idea, a real, pretty much established idea of when Solomon's reign begins, and thus when he begins to work on the temple. So this verse comes into play. We have to back up 480 years, and we will get to the Exodus. So if the temple is dedicated around 965 BC, we add 480 years, and we come up with a date 1445 to 1450. We're going to be speaking in general terms here, but there's the Exodus. So not in the time of the Ramses around 1250, but 200 years earlier, around 1450 in the time of the Middle Kingdom. Now let's go back a little further. Scripture says the promise to Abraham was by God that he should know for certain, as part of the Abrahamic covenant, that he should know for certain that his offspring would be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there for and be afflicted for 400 years. That promise is repeated in Acts chapter 7, so we have an understanding that the New Testament writers believe that to be a historical case. All right, so if we are sojourning for 400 years, then I think we could do this. If the Exodus is 1445 to 1450, then we take 400 years back to the time of Joseph. The family is going to go from 70 persons at the end of Joseph's life to the millions that Moses is going to lead out of Egypt. So we have 400 years in which they are prospering, they are multiplying, they are becoming enslaved eventually in Egypt. And so that puts the time of Joseph back to around 1850. Are you following me? So we're building a biblical chronology based on dates that Scripture itself gives us, beginning with Solomon's temple. All right, so then we look at the ages of the patriarchs. Now we can't just add these together because one patriarch is born sort of in the middle of the previous patriarch's life, right? So Joseph's life is recorded at 110 years. Jacob is recorded at 147. Isaac is recorded at 180. And Abraham is recorded at 175. But we have to look a little bit closer. We can't just simply add their ages up to add them to our chronology. So here's what we can do. Abraham, according to Genesis 17, was 100 years old when Isaac was born to him. Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born, and Jacob lived for 147 years, which gets us right into the time of Joseph. Are you following me? All right, so maybe we could come up with a suggested chronology. I'll read it from the bottom, and then we'll read it from the top and see if it makes sense to you. So at the bottom, we have that date for the Exodus around 1450. All right, then we have the 400 years of multiplication in Egypt, gets us back to 1850. Then we have the life of Joseph at 110 years, so that's 1960. Jacob is born then in 1997. Isaac is born in 2057, and Abraham is born then in 2157. Now, these are approximate, and we could, give us a little leeway for, the inexpertise of your teacher and the generalization, the rounding of maybe some numbers. But I think we're in a good spot to put the patriarchal period beginning around 2100. 2150, 2200, right in there. And then we have the patriarchal period, and then we have that multiplication time that takes us right into Exodus, which means that if the Exodus began in 1450, we know that Moses is 80 years at the time. So 1450, then we will, in this case, because we're moving forward in time, we're going to subtract 40 years for wandering in the desert, which is going to put the conquest stage, the time when Moses passes away and Joshua is ready to lead people into the land in the conquest stage. So that's going to begin about 1410. And the conquest stage is going to last for the life of Joshua. And it says at the end of Joshua, the elders after him. So one of the things that we'll need to do next then is build in the next stage, which is the judges stage. How would that flesh out? So what I like to do is I want to build my biblical chronology and then work to make the evidence from other nations, like that disputed Egyptian chronology, have it match or try to fit it within a biblical framework, because I'm much more confident in the biblical framework than I am in Egypt. All right, we will talk to you again soon. Thanks for listening.